A petty HOA bully thought she could teach my daughter a lesson until she learned the hard way that justice lives next door. The scream tore through the summer air like a siren. I dropped my glass of iced tea and ran barefoot through the backyard, heart hammering, lungs already burning. My 5-year-old daughter, Ava, was tangled in something behind the bushes that bordered our neighbor's property. Blood was on her arms, her little sundress shredded. It wasn't brambles. It was razor wire. Not just a loose coil, but a twisted snare, deliberate, hidden under leaves and debris on our shared property line. Someone had laid a trap. Minutes later, while I held a sobbing Ava to my chest, ambulance lights flickering against our picket fence, the truth started to unravel. The neighbor, known throughout our HOA as Karen, had complained endlessly about Ava's trespassing, her flower beds, her lawn, her peace and quiet. But this wasn't a complaint. This was a crime. What Karen didn't know, what no one in this community club of lawn obsessives and rule sticklers had cared to learn, was that I'm a federal judge, and I don't just interpret the law, I enforce it. She thought this was about a kid stepping on her begonias. She didn't know she had declared war on the wrong mother. It was the kind of neighborhood where the grass never dared to grow too long. Mailboxes matched, hedges were trimmed like topiary art, and children's laughter rarely pierced the silence before dusk. From the outside, Maple Hollow seemed picture perfect, the sort of community realtors fawned over and Instagram moms flocked to. Nestled on the edge of a small city, it offered safety, structure, and the comforting illusion of order. When I moved in with my daughter Ava 3 years ago, I believed I had found peace. After years of long trials and hardened defendants, the rhythm of this place felt like a balm. Mornings brought the scent of hydrangeas and fresh mulch, and evenings ended with porch lights flicking on like synchronized stars. I kept to myself, mostly. I smiled politely at dog walkers and gave a nod to the occasional jogger. I wasn't looking for friends, just normalcy. Ava was the bright spot in our little corner of calm. Curious and free-spirited, she had a way of finding wonder in everything. She danced in sprinklers, chased butterflies, and made up stories about the birds that visited our feeders. I let her explore the backyard freely. It was fenced, safe, bordered by flower beds and shrubs that marked the invisible lines between our home and the others. Directly behind us lived a woman named Karen. I didn't learn her name for several months, even though her presence was unmistakable. She never waved. She never spoke. She watched. Whether from her kitchen window or when tending to her immaculate garden, her eyes followed every move Ava made. I noticed it, but I didn't give it weight. Not at first. There were rules in this community. Pages and pages of them. Trash cans out no earlier than 6. Grass cut every 10 days. No seasonal decorations before October 1st. The HOA sent out monthly bulletins like gospel, and most people obeyed without question. I did, too. Not because I feared the consequences, but because I believed in being a good neighbor. That belief would soon be tested in ways I couldn't imagine. Behind the smiling yards and flower-lined sidewalks, something colder thrived here. A quiet intolerance dressed up in pastels. I just hadn't seen it clearly yet, but Karen had, and she was waiting. The first note was folded neatly and tucked beneath the doormat. I remember the way it was written, as though it were meant to sound polite but couldn't quite hide the edge. Please remind your child to stay within your property boundaries. Some of us take pride in our lawns. It wasn't signed, but I knew exactly where it came from. Karen's cursive was sharp and controlled, like someone who had spent too many years correcting others. I sighed, tossed it in the kitchen drawer, and let Ava finish her popsicle in peace. A week later, a notice from the HOA arrived. It referenced an incident involving a minor entering a neighbor's yard without permission. It wasn't accusatory, just carefully worded, heavy with implication. I responded with a short email, reminding them that our lots weren't divided by solid barriers, and that a 5-year-old chasing a butterfly was hardly an act of trespassing. They thanked me for my feedback. The next day, a second note appeared on the porch. Karen had begun documenting everything. Tiny footprints in the mulch, a broken bloom on her lilies, a red ball left near the edge of her patio. I started finding them returned on our porch, sometimes with handwritten labels taped to them. Yours? She scrawled across the ball's surface in permanent marker. I tried speaking with her once. I caught her out front, pruning her rose bushes, and approached slowly, careful not to seem confrontational. She didn't look up when I greeted her. When I mentioned the notes, she finally turned and said, "Your daughter is not my responsibility." Her tone was clipped, her face unreadable. The next HOA bulletin included a section on property boundaries and resident safety. It was generic, but I could read between the lines. I started getting the sense that Karen had influence here. Maybe she had friends on the board. Maybe they were tired of complaints and eager to keep the peace, no matter how ridiculous the complaints were. Ava remained blissfully unaware. She still played in the yard, still skipped along the garden edge with her plastic wand and paper wings. I kept a closer eye, but I didn't want to shadow her joy. I didn't yet know how far Karen would go. I still believed even then that it was only pettiness. It was late afternoon when it happened, the kind of summer day that felt too still, too quiet. I had just poured a glass of iced tea and was reaching for a novel when I heard Ava scream. It wasn't a cry of surprise or frustration. It was sharp and immediate, a sound that turned the air inside out. I dropped everything and ran, my bare feet pounding across the deck, into the yard, toward the thicket of shrubs that marked the rear edge of our property. She was on the ground, curled in on herself like a wounded animal. Her dress was torn and streaked with red. At first I thought she had fallen into brambles, but as I pulled her up into my arms, I saw the cuts, long, thin slices across her legs and arms. They weren't the kind of scratches you got from nature. They were deeper, angrier. And then I saw it, half hidden under a pile of brush and leaves, metal, coiled, shiny, and cruel. Razor wire. Not loose, not discarded. It had been placed deliberately, strung in a way that someone had hoped wouldn't be seen. My breath caught, my vision narrowed. I held Ava tighter as she sobbed against my chest. Her voice shook as she asked if she had done something bad. I called 911 with one hand, while cradling her with the other. The dispatcher kept asking if there was someone still on the scene. I didn't answer. I was staring across the yard, where Karen stood near the fence line, pruning shears in hand. She watched me without speaking. Not a flicker of emotion crossed her face. She didn't move, didn't offer help, didn't call out, just stood there, perfectly still, like a statue carved out of ice. The ambulance came quickly. Paramedics wrapped Ava's arms in gauze and gently loaded her into the back. One of them glanced toward the wire and shook his head. "This wasn't an accident," he muttered under his breath. I followed them, clutching my bag, heart pounding, fury rising with every bump in the road. At the hospital, they cleaned her wounds, checked for infection, and gave her something mild for the pain. I kissed her forehead and whispered that she would be okay. But deep inside, something in me had shifted. A line had been crossed, and the woman behind it would soon understand just how badly she had miscalculated. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and latex. Ava lay on the small bed, her arms wrapped in clean white bandages, her eyes heavy with exhaustion and fear. She didn't speak much after the doctors finished. When the nurse gently touched her hand to take vitals, she flinched and pulled away. Her voice, normally full of imagination and questions, was quiet. She asked if the lady was going to come back. I told her no. I told her she was safe now, but I wasn't sure either of us believed it. The doctor said the cuts would heal. Some would scar, but they had been lucky. A little deeper, a little longer in the wire, and we could have been facing something far worse. I nodded, thanked him, and smiled for Ava. I waited until we were alone to cry. It wasn't loud, just silent tears that I wiped quickly so she wouldn't see. I had seen pain in 1,000 forms during my years on the bench, but nothing prepared me for the sight of my own child bleeding in the grass. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound made her sit up in bed. I lay beside her, holding her hand, whispering stories about stars and safe places, until she finally drifted off. Even then, she tossed and turned, her legs kicking at invisible threats. I stayed awake, not just because I wanted to protect her, but because I couldn't stop playing it over in my head. The wire, the hiding place, Karen's cold expression. I thought about the rules people like Karen live by, the ones that let them wrap cruelty in neat language and hollow civility. She had complained, written notes, called out violations, but in the end, she chose to lay a trap for a 5-year-old. It wasn't just reckless, it was intentional. Ava's injury had turned my world from calm to electric. My instincts as a mother were already in motion, but the part of me that wore the robe, that listened to facts and handed down judgment, was now fully awake. This wasn't going to fade with time. It wasn't going to be forgotten, and it wasn't going to be forgiven. I requested an emergency meeting with the HOA the morning after we returned from the hospital. The board agreed to convene that evening in the clubhouse, a beige room with folding chairs and the smell of coffee that had been left too long on a burner. I brought a folder of photos and medical reports, and I arrived early, hoping that presenting facts would make the next steps clear. I still believed that some part of this community valued reason. By the time the board members filtered in, Karen had already taken a seat near the front. She wore a soft yellow blouse and a pinched expression, as if she were the one under attack. I stayed seated as I described what had happened, my voice even, my hands steady. I laid the photos on the table and slid the medical report across the polished surface. They nodded. They frowned. Then they asked if it could have been an old fence line, maybe something left behind by a previous owner. Maybe Ava had wandered where she wasn't supposed to go. I told them the wire was newly placed, intentionally hidden, and secured with ties. I showed them a time-stamped photo I had taken after the ambulance left. They exchanged looks but said nothing. One of them finally leaned forward and asked if I had any proof that Karen had placed it. Karen, for her part, remained calm. She admitted to filing complaints, said she had spoken to the HOA more than once, and repeated her claim that Ava had been warned to stay away from her property. She denied knowing anything about razor wire. She said she was horrified by what had happened. A man in a blazer adjusted his glasses and suggested this might be a misunderstanding, a communication failure. Maybe emotions were running high, and people needed time to reflect. Another board member offered to have a contractor inspect the area and install a small fence, for safety. Just to be sure. They wanted it to go away. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't interested in responsibility. They were interested in quiet. In pretending that what happened could be patched over with a polite letter and some wood planks. I gathered my folder, stood, and thanked them for their time. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had been given everything I needed. They had chosen a side. Now I would choose mine. Before I was Ava's mother, before I was a homeowner in a neighborhood that worshipped lawn symmetry, I was a federal prosecutor. I spent a decade in a courtroom where the air always felt cold, no matter how many bodies filled the space. I wore suits that never wrinkled and kept my voice measured even while cross-examining men who had stolen lives without remorse. I didn't flinch when witnesses wept or when defendants stared me down. I understood the rules. I respected the power that came with the oath I had taken. Eventually, I earned a nomination. The call came on a Tuesday morning. The process that followed was rigorous, political, and often brutal. But I passed through it, and I put on the robe with full understanding of what it meant. I was no longer just arguing the law. I was interpreting it, deciding how it applied in moments where lives could shift forever. I learned to keep a straight face, to weigh facts without letting emotions pull me off center. It wasn't about who I liked. It was about what was just. When Ava was born, something shifted. It didn't undo my work, but it changed the way I viewed everything. Every case that involved a child hit harder. I still did my job, still kept my decisions grounded in precedent, but it began to wear on me. I took a leave after one trial that involved a 7-year-old. That's when I realized I couldn't keep living in the storm. I wanted peace. I wanted safety. I wanted Ava to grow up with birdsong and sidewalk chalk instead of sirens and sealed evidence bags. So we moved. I picked a neighborhood where people watered their lawns and waved from driveways. I thought it would be enough. I thought justice lived in cities and courtrooms, while quiet lived here. But I was wrong. Now I looked at my daughter's bandaged arms and realized that justice was never something you could leave behind. It travels with you, waits for you to call it forward. I had stayed quiet for long enough. The woman behind the robe had not disappeared. She had only been resting. The next morning, after Ava had finally fallen asleep curled against me, I began assembling everything I would need. I moved through the house in silence, careful not to wake her. Every step felt deliberate. I wasn't thinking like a neighbor anymore. I was thinking like the woman who had built entire cases on nothing but inconsistencies and arrogance. I returned to the spot behind the shrubs, and photographed the wire in its full context. It was looped and secured with zip ties, some of which had been weathered but not old. There were no signs of rust, no decay, just clean plastic and sharp metal coiled beneath the leaves. I documented the placement, the proximity to our property line, and the trampled dirt where Ava had fallen. I bagged a small piece of the wire using gloves and stored it properly, just like I had taught junior prosecutors during training sessions. I went through every HOA letter we had received, organizing them by date and marking the ones that came directly after Ava had been outside. I printed out emails, highlighted phrases that suggested ongoing hostility, and flagged language that revealed how Karen had built her case against my daughter. I wasn't looking for petty behavior anymore. I was looking for a pattern. Next, I reached out to the one neighbor I trusted, a retired teacher named Margaret, who lived 2 doors down. She had always smiled at Ava, left chalk drawings on the sidewalk, and brought over extra cookies at Christmas. I asked if she had noticed anything strange behind our yard in the past few weeks. Her expression darkened. She told me she had seen Karen dragging something near the bushes early one morning, a few days before the incident. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, she said, it made her stomach turn. I thanked her and wrote everything down. That evening, I installed 2 discrete cameras overlooking the back edge of the yard. They wouldn't undo what had happened, but they would make sure no one tried it again. Karen had spent weeks documenting what she saw as violations. I had started documenting crimes. The difference was, I knew exactly how the law worked, and I knew how to use it. By the end of the week, I had filed 2 complaints. One civil, one criminal. I delivered the paperwork to the sheriff's office myself. The civil suit named Karen directly, citing negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and reckless endangerment. The criminal complaint referenced child endangerment statutes under both state and federal codes. I included photos, medical records, and a sworn statement from Margaret. I didn't knock on Karen's door. I let the deputy do that. I was home when she was served. I watched from the kitchen window as she opened the door, still wearing her gardening gloves. The expression on her face shifted slowly, like she couldn't quite process what the man in uniform was saying. She reached for the papers with a shaky hand, glanced at them, and then looked straight across the yard. Her mouth opened, but she didn't speak. She just stood there, as if the world had tipped sideways and she was the only one still trying to balance. Within 2 days, the HOA received a formal subpoena requesting all internal communications related to Karen's complaints against my daughter. I wanted their meeting minutes, their email threads, their records of who said what and when. The board, so eager to smooth things over during the emergency meeting, suddenly found themselves very interested in accountability. The president called me personally and asked if we could talk things through. I told him the time for talking had passed. The local police began their investigation. An officer came to the house and inspected the razor wire. He asked questions, took more photos, and confirmed that what I had found was not old fencing. It was industrial wire used for deterrent purposes. He didn't say much, but I could tell he had seen enough. He promised to follow up soon. Karen stopped working in her yard. Her curtains stayed drawn. The neighbors who used to nod in her direction now passed by without a glance. I had not gone public with what she had done, but word was spreading. People noticed when a child is hurt. They notice even more when someone starts pulling the strings of law and consequence. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't knocked on doors or sent angry emails. I had simply brought the truth forward. Now the system she thought she controlled was turning its focus on her. And there was no HOA policy to hide behind. The story broke on a Thursday afternoon. A small local station aired a segment titled, "Federal Judge's Daughter Injured by Alleged HOA Trap," and by nightfall, 2 more outlets had picked it up. The details were restrained but clear. A 5-year-old girl had been injured by razor wire placed on a property line. A neighbor known for filing complaints was under investigation. And her mother, a sitting federal judge, had filed suit. By Friday morning, a van from a regional news affiliate was parked at the end of our street. They didn't knock. They just stood at a respectful distance, hoping for a comment. I stayed inside with Ava, drawing shapes in the steam on the kitchen window while she played with her crayons. She was starting to smile again, but the trust in her eyes hadn't fully returned. That would take time. Karen, however, had vanished from view. No gardening, no morning walks, no porch lights at dusk. Her once perfect lawn had patches of yellowing grass and weeds creeping along the edges. The silence around her house grew heavier each day. The HOA held a closed meeting the following week, but that didn't stop word from leaking. Residents had begun whispering about past complaints, about favoritism, about rules enforced unevenly. A few long-time neighbors called for the board president to resign. Someone posted the meeting minutes online, and comments flooded in. The narrative had shifted. It was no longer about a child wandering too close to a flower bed. It was about power and cruelty, wrapped in neighborhood rules. A reporter reached out asking if I wanted to make a public statement. I declined. My job wasn't to feed the headlines. I had filed my motions, presented my evidence, and let the wheels of justice move at their pace. The court didn't care about gossip. Neither did I. Still, I watched the coverage. I saw how the community reacted when the curtain was pulled back. Karen had once counted on silence, on social pressure and polite fear to keep everyone in line. Now her isolation was louder than anything I could have said. Karen was charged with 2 misdemeanors and 1 felony. The reckless endangerment charge stuck. The district attorney cited clear evidence of intent. The photos I submitted, the placement of the wire, the statement from Margaret, and the medical report from the hospital all built a case that was difficult to ignore. Karen pleaded not guilty, but her attorney pushed for a plea deal before the first hearing. They knew a trial would bring more attention. They knew the community was already watching. The court accepted the plea. She received probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. The judge's tone was measured, but firm. She was ordered to issue a formal apology to Ava in writing, and she was barred from holding any position on the HOA board for 5 years. It wasn't the maximum, but it was enough. The weight of accountability had landed. On the civil side, I pursued damages in Ava's name. The settlement was substantial. Karen's insurance covered part of it, but the rest came from her own accounts. I didn't do it for the money. I did it because consequences should have weight, and I wanted Ava to have something good come from something so ugly. The HOA changed too. The board president resigned. 2 other members followed within a month. A special election was held, and for the first time since we moved in, neighbors came together not just to gossip, but to act. New bylaws were passed. Rules became clearer. Complaints had to be documented, reviewed, and confirmed by more than 1 board member before action could be taken. The new leadership removed all remaining razor wire from common property and scheduled regular safety checks. I watched it unfold without fanfare. I didn't speak at the meetings. I didn't push for more. I had done what I came to do. Karen's house went up for sale 2 months later. The lawn was overgrown. The listing said, "Motivated seller." I didn't attend the open house. I didn't need to see her leave. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves quietly, pulling each thread until the lie unravels. What Karen did had been cruel, but what followed was fair. That was enough. Ava was safe. The trap was gone, and the law, in every sense, had done its work. Spring returned slowly that year. The ground thawed, the trees budded. Ava began asking to go outside again, just for a little while. At first, she stayed close to the porch, watching the breeze tug at the grass. Then one day, she ran barefoot across the yard, chasing a monarch like nothing had ever happened. We built the garden together. Neighbors donated flowers, stepping stones, and small ceramic creatures. One woman brought a wooden bench her late husband had carved. Ava chose the colors and helped plant milkweed and lavender. She named the butterflies that visited and drew each one in a little notebook with shaky, determined lines. The garden sat where the wire once had. In the same patch of ground where she was hurt, beauty now grew in deliberate shapes. Each bloom felt like a quiet answer to something unspeakable. Every petal was a form of reclaiming. Sometimes I sat on the bench and watched her play, her curls bouncing in the sunlight, her laughter rising without hesitation. I thought about the road we had taken to get here. The silence, the dismissal, the rage, and finally the resolution. Justice had not erased the pain, but it had made room for healing. Ava didn't ask about Karen anymore. She asked about bees and weather and how many butterflies would come next. That was the only future I wanted to think about, the one where Ava ran free. the one where the garden grew, the one where the danger had passed.